Starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. Every developing country's ultimate goal is to become a developed countries, right? They wanted to open as many doors as possible for the best economic development to secure themselves for the future. Indonesia, as one of the developing countries which has now joined Asian economic community, now owns this urgency to create better workforce so that we can compete in the market and secure ourselves better future. We also think that workforce and also progress of the nation and also the economic development is very correlated to education, right? This is why we step in and wanted to talk about education in today's debate. We think that the problem in Indonesia's current education system that it is that it is very value oriented. There is certain emphasis on budi pekerti, for example, on beradab dan berbudaya, for example, and also certain phases of nationalism, right? We think that it is first arbitrary and secondly biased. What do we mean by this? When we talk about arbitrary, it's that this value is never critically thought about, right? There's no discussion, there's no forum in which we're gonna instill or have an objective parameter on how we're gonna instill this kind of value. It is mostly influenced by certain people that hold certain position of power. For example, in Indonesia right now, Jokowi has this agenda to create insan berbudi mulia, for example, which is pretty arbitrary and also only correlates to his presidency, right? It changes over time. For example, now we're gonna have to change the value that we wanted to instill in the next 5 years because Jokowi might not be the president in the next 5 years. So I think that it's pretty arbitrary. But secondly, it is biased, and this is more important, we think, than the first point. Why so? Because it might come from certain uncritical point of view, uncritical construct, which might be non-progressive and even discriminative. For example, when we talk about certain imposing certain notion of norma agama and norma sosial, for example, that might means the exclusion of certain gender identity. That might means the inclusion of LGBTQIA children and their valuation of their identity, and also that might means pro patriarchy, for example, right? Because for example, women by Kodrat is not supposed to have any professional job and they should be just like at home, right? So that might mean and result in installation of notion that is quite non-progressive and just doesn't fit today's standards of progress, of social progress, and also inclusion for all. So this is why education system not need to be put into scrutiny today. So in the government side of the house, we think that the goal of education is to create a non-dogmatic intellectual space for children to create identity for themselves and also to self-actualize. This is our emphasis of today. We think that this can only be created when you have skill acquisitions as an emphasis. And this by skill acquisition we mean like critical thinking skills and also problem solving skills. Science, mathematics, logic, deduction, while art and sports are just the subjects that we wanted to instill these skills within, but also we wanted to talk about emotional regulation and health because we think that it is very important for us to create to instill in our children their skills to actually regulate themselves emotionally. This is why we wanted to push for a better education agenda by having skill acquisition as our main point rather than value acquisition. We're gonna talk about three arguments in my speech. First, that skill acquisition is the essence of education. Secondly, how this will result in a better workforce. And thirdly, how value acquisition can only happen when you have instilled certain standard of skill acquisition. Moving on to my first argument, why skill acquisition is the essence of education. We think that the essence of education, which is self-actualizations, mean that children which hasn't had the rationality yet now has to join our larger society, right? Now has to integrate themselves into our society. This certainly make them have to have a certain calculation to know themselves, to think for themselves, and also figure their place out in this world. We think that this can only happen when you first know how to teach them practically. Secondly, know the steps in which you're gonna make them constantly improve in their skills. And thirdly, have an objective measurement to calculate whether or not they have had the skills or not. This can only happen when you have skill acquisition as your main point, right? Because skills can be taught practically. That you can also teach the teacher to teach the children how to, well, spell, how to think for themselves, how to problem solve, how you, or how can you discuss in history classes, for example, the acts or the atrocity of what has happened in our society as we progress, and also discuss how to prevent that kind of things from happening ever again in the future, for example, right? And you can also have the steps, because this can be improved gradually. For example, now you have, well, mathematics at grade 1, then you learn calculus, for example, at grade 9th, for example, right? So we think that this has the ladder that the students can step into gradually. And also you have the objective measurement. You can tell these children that you, for example, failed this class or you have succeeded in this class. So there is an internal incentive for them to actually improve, because they know how good they are or how not good they are at certain subjects and at these skills that they are supposed to have, right? So this is why education system need to be focused on self-actualization, because the students need to calculate for themselves and figure themselves out to integrate into our better into the better society, into our society. And also this will create a better workforce, because now because now we cannot deny that workforce is objectively measured as well, and also has the emphasis of professionalism and also set skills, right? You cannot simply put people out there, for example, by instilling nationalism without really telling them how to do their job properly. For example, preparing them for to become a better doctor, for example, when you're a med student. So we think that this will create better workforce and having better competition when we compare it well to another countries which has the emphasis on skill acquisition. But last point, how at the end of the day value acquisition can only happen when you have the rationale and also the logical thinking and deduction for you to figure the meaning of those kind of value acquisitions and integrate that to yourself, right? So when, well, the teachers have certain dogma or certain ideology that they wanted to impose, the children, when they have had this critical thinking skill, they can think from themselves and integrate that to their own moral compass, and thus creating having themselves the independence to think for themselves and also figure themselves out morally, right? So we think that ultimately education system should focus more on skill acquisition than value acquisition, and we stand by that. We're very proud to propose this motion.